there, Rev Divers. We are excited again to bring back Claire Ernst for your Spill from the Hill. And it is a perfect time to be talking about the Spill from the Hill because we've got some super exciting news for you guys. Welcome, Claire. How are you?
I'm good. It's Friday. It's not raining, and we successfully averted cuts to Medicare last night. So I am pretty good.
I am super stoked because I have been having questions and Cam has been having lots of conversations with people all over the nation about what is going on with PayGo. Are we going to get this 4% cut? And the conversion factor has gone down, and just so much stress around the financial stability of their practice coming into 2022. Yeah. And then there's this powerhouse piece of legislation that happened yesterday that really is driving all kinds of improvement and positive reinforcement for financial stability. And I'm hoping you can dive into that for us and explain what that means to our Rev Divers.
Yeah, absolutely. Yes. So it's been a whirlwind of a week. This all started earlier than this week because for months now we knew that, well, for longer than that, we knew that these cuts were coming. And so we've been trying to build momentum for months. But we were successful earlier this week in getting a bill introduced in the House, which was subsequently passed. And then it was also passed in the Senate last night. And so what the bill does, just to break it down in terms of, because it's pretty, comprehensive. And so there's essentially 4 different payment pieces. It's larger, it deals with the debt ceiling and some farmer sequester issues, but for our purposes, I will stick just to the Medicare stuff. And so what it does first is that there was a cut that was supposed to be scheduled that was stemming from the Medicare physician fee schedule conversion factor. That cut, it's a cut in the sense where, trying to think about how to explain this in the easiest way. So basically, 3.75% was the cut that we were expecting the conversion factor. Instead of getting that, we are now going to have a 0.75% cut through the end of 2022. That cut happened in the first place because back in 2021, there were some positive payment updates that took place for office visits, so for E&M visits. And because those office visits were revalued and because Medicare is budget neutral, and Medicare is basically like a zero-sum game. If you make any increases, you have to make some decreases. And so when the visits went up, we had to experience a negative impact to the conversion factor, which just happens to be the multiplier across the entire calculation. So it brought down a lot of visits. Congress was generous enough last year to appropriate $3 billion into the conversion factor, which in essence led to the 3.75% cut. So the good news is that the office visits are still, they're still increased in value. And we were asking for, we had to ask basically for more money to be appropriated until we found a better long-term solution to this problem, which is going to happen essentially every single year until we do find that solution. And so that's the first piece of the legislation, is that it would essentially mitigate 3% of that 3.75% cut to the conversion factor. The second part of it deals with a statutory PayGo, which is basically anytime that there is a lot of money that is required for legislation that's passed. So in this case, it was the American Rescue Plan Act, which was passed, I think, earlier in March. That money has to be offset. And so it's offset by triggering these essentially sequesters across certain spending. And so Congress can actually, it's sort of a loophole, they can actually waive PayGo. So they can essentially wipe the scorecard clean. However, they can't do that during reconciliation for procedural purposes. And so because the American Rescue Plan Act was passed through reconciliation, they couldn't put anything in there that said we're wiping the scorecard clean. Also, that legislation, as you probably know, was pretty partisan. And so there wasn't a ton of, enthusiasm from the other, one side of the aisle to waive this right away. And so we were getting a little panicky because statutory PayGo has never actually been triggered for Medicare. And so I just assumed it was going to get done, but we were getting down the wire and it wasn't getting done. And the legislation that was moving was another reconciliation bill, the Build Back Better Act, and we couldn't get it done in that. So fortunately, this legislation does prevent the 4% cut that would occur due to PayGo from going into effect through through the end of the year. So no, like next year we have to deal with it again. And then another piece was the cuts to Medicare lab reimbursement. And so just a little bit about that. Anyone who has a physician office lab would want to pay attention to this. The Protecting Access to Medicare Act, PAMA, that was passed in 2014, some of the policies in that law and in subsequent regulations basically redid the formula for data reporting and coming up with the calculation for reimbursement for labs, which led certain labs to potentially face up to 15% in cuts. And the CARES Act last year that was passed, which was that major piece of legislation dealing with coronavirus aid. One of the many things that was in there delayed those cuts for a year. And so they were going to go back into effect at the end of this year. And now they're going to be delayed another year, which gives us, similarly to the other cuts, more time, time for another bite of the apple to figure out how we're going to solve this in the future. And then the last piece is the 2% Medicare sequester, which I'm sure just activates everybody when I use the word Medicare sequester.
Yes, I am activated by that.
Activated.
Yeah, trigger.
Word. Yeah. So, in the Budget Control Act of 2011 put forward this Medicare sequester. So it's been in effect for almost 10 years. And basically it's a 2% cut on top of Medicare reimbursement. And it's something that, in our opinion at MGMA, it is something that, sequesters in general that have really nothing to do with Medicare. The fact that it's Congress's inability to deal with budgetary affairs and then having to suffer the consequences, through Medicare is not something that we're particularly fond of. And so we've been wanting to modify or reform Medicare sequester for a long time. During the COVID epidemic, which is still ongoing, for the CARES Act, there was a provision in there that would delay, so essentially put a moratorium on that 2% going forward. And then there was subsequent legislation that extended that. And so we were part of the effort to continuously extend it. The latest legislation that was passed earlier this year had it ending at the end of this year. So we asked, along with many other stakeholders, the hospitals were very involved in this as well. We asked for it to be extended. And so we were granted that to some extent. So for basically from January through March 2022, we will not have the 2% sequester. It is still going to be on hold. From April through June 2022, it's phased in at 1%. So you'll experience a 1% Medicare sequester. And then starting in July 2022 through the end of the year in ongoing, it returns back to the 2%. And so although it's not exactly what we asked for in the sense where it's not delayed indefinitely, we also didn't expect it to be delayed indefinitely because it's been a sequester that's been in effect for a very long time, and it's going to require more than just continuously suspending it. So we went from expecting to on January 1st, 2022 to experience a 9.75% cut to Medicare, not including cuts to labs. We went from that to now expecting a 0.75% cut to Medicare for January 1st. And so although it doesn't solve everything, it is much better than we were 24 hours ago. And it gives us an opportunity to work with Congress to come up with some more comprehensive, workable solutions for the future. Something that I like to point out, not to panic people, but one of the reasons that the conversion factor dropped to 3.75 or one of the reasons that it dropped was because of the increases to the office visits, but also this GCode that CMS developed, which was an add-on code for complex visits that they expected to be used virtually with every office visit. This was a code that would be about 3.25% of the cut to the conversion factor, which when it was estimated at the time, in fall of 2020, before Congress appropriated that money, it was estimated that about 3% of that 10% original cut to the conversion factor came from the G-code. So the G-code has been, so the G-code's been delayed for 3 years. So 2021, 2, and 3. So in 2024, it would in theory go live, and that would paired with the cut to the conversion factor for the increased E&M visits, that's looking more like 7%. And so that, with the fact that we're dealing with PayGo again in a year and dealing constantly with sequester, leads us to think, okay, well, we're going to have to come up with some other solutions here. And Congress has been talking about the potential of reopening and discussing MACRA, which reminder is the law that set up essentially the QPP with MIPS and APMs. And, it's a system that, is fraught with issues. There's a lot of burden associated with MIPS, and the whole point of it, a large part of MACRA was trying to incentivize practices and physicians to move from the MIPS program to APMs, to value-based care. And in theory, you could guess that they wanted them to do that in the 6th year, by 2021, because that's when the positive adjustment for MIPS zeroed out. And now here we are going into 2022, and there's not nearly enough APMs. There's not the opportunity to move into value-based care. And so that, paired with these cuts that we're going to experience every year, definitely lends itself to a larger conversation about Medicare reform.
Wow. Oh my gosh, Claire, this is so helpful for our Rev divers. Thank you so much for sharing this information. And, I think it's also important for our Rev divers to stay not only aware of what's happening, but advocate on behalf of their organizations. At that advocacy could certainly be, from a legislative perspective, but also within your organizations. And when I think of advocacy, I'm thinking about the use of Category 3 codes, so that we are documenting, services that need to be recognized, right? And then also, looking at your fee schedules, analyzing them, understanding what your revenue is going to look like when these payment cuts occur, thinking about, ahead of time, how are you going to start, adjusting off for sequester payments, right? And just kind of thinking about it from that perspective. As we're looking into, the first and second quarters of 2022, anything else that, we should be on the lookout for? I know that, there's a big telehealth, push for behavioral health, and, anything else that we need to think about that's coming up on the horizon.
Yeah. I mean, I think there's always things coming up in the horizon for health policy. I think telehealth is a good thing to flag. there's been a lot of effort in Congress to get telehealth expanded permanently to a point where almost I feel like every member of Congress like wants a piece of the pie and like has introduced some form of legislation. There's a lot of repetition in some of these pieces of legislation. I think that, it's really very dependent and tied to the status of the public health emergency. So back in October, it was renewed. So it'll be renewed through like half of mid-January. My own personal opinion is it'll get renewed again with Omicron and the fact that a lot of people are going to be traveling for the holidays and cases are going up. But, I think that once we see the conclusion of the public health emergency kind of like on the horizon, I think that's when Congress is going to be more inclined to act. And when they do that, I think it's going to look kind of like the MedPAC, not their official recommendation, but what they put in their report last year, which would be an extension for a period of time, perhaps 1 or 2 years, while they gather data and they gather on clinical outcomes, on cost to the program. The Medicare trust fund is not overflowing. It doesn't overflow with cash right now. And so I think once they get that information, then we can decide whether or not they want to make it permanent. So I think to answer your question, it might not happen in Q1 or Q2, but it's certainly something that they're paying a lot of attention to. And I expect to see something probably in the next year to address it.
Wow. And what do you think is going to happen with this audio only telehealth? Because I've got to tell you, the more we're educating people about audio only, and yes, it was, we see some things in the final rule, but they're all for mental health and substance use disorder treatment. I'm hearing a lot of frustration, particularly from rural providers. Do you see that continuing to be a conversation?
Yeah, I do see it. There's been legislation introduced that MGMA helped work on to have CMS cover those codes past the public health emergency expiration, which is something they expressed that they didn't want to do outside of mental health. Fortunately, they changed the definition of telecommunications within their regulation, and they modified it, and they were specific to mental health. But the fact that like a year ago, me angrily writing in our comments that we thought that it was in their regulatory authority to change that definition, and them saying no, like we've always interpreted telehealth as two-way face audio, and then the fact that they did it this year, all that it's just for mental health, but that's a step in the right direction because they are starting to, I think, accept that that is something that is needed. I think part of the piece will be the payment parity piece and how much you can be paid and reimbursed for those codes and how attainable, or how sustainable that will be to your practice. But we intend to continue to push for audio only outside of just mental health visits, because we do think it's incredibly important in rural areas. And the more information we can get on that, the better our chances are of doing it. I think a lot of practices in rural areas I've heard anecdotally and seen some data where practices will start visits as a telehealth visit, and then they'll lose connection for whatever reason, and it becomes an audio only visit. And so if that's happening, it's definitely something that needs to be addressed. So I think there is momentum, especially from members of Congress in rural areas who are hearing about it. And so if that's something that is important to you in your practice, and you live especially if you live in a rural area, I recommend getting in contact with your members of Congress and providing them with any data or anecdotes you may have.
That's awesome. The other thing that I think is going to be top of mind for medical practices would be vaccine administration, and doing that within medical practices. Do you see anything that you may want to share that you've heard on the Hill related to COVID-19 vaccine administration?
I haven't heard a ton about administration. Right now, the conversation is mostly around mandates for administering vaccines. And so that's something that we've been keeping an eye on, just in the sense where, our members need to know whether or not it's mandated or not. And as of right now, every single, there's technically 3 different rules, 4 if you include the healthcare ETS that's supposed to expire in a week and a half. But they're all, with the exception of the healthcare ETS, the other 3 are all stayed. So basically on hold pending further litigation developments. And so, like, my own personal opinion is that they're not all going to make it through, just based off of the court composition. But we will definitely see. It probably will not happen. Well, we've passed the first deadline for all of them, or for 2 of them. So
yeah, I was going to ask about the OSHA ETS, because I was speaking to it, teaching to it, updating my slides, and literally from one week to the next, there was this massive change on the website, big red letters like, stop, this has been totally halted right now. And so I didn't know if you had a quick comment on what that whole thing was, because I was kind of surprised to see, like, wait, stop. I know there was a lot of frustration when it first came out. And so I was surprised, but a little pleased to see that they were like, okay, hold on, we need to think it all the way through.
Yeah, so they did that because there were a lot of lawsuits specifically on that mandate. And so it originally went to the Fifth Circuit of Appeals, and they stayed it. And then because this is like my nerdy legal side, like, I think this is really interesting. There are so many lawsuits that they had to essentially, like, put them into a lottery system and then choose a court, like, randomly to decide the fate of it. And it turns out that it was the Sixth Court, which is largely conservative. And so it's in the hands of the Sixth Court right now. And that is why OSHA and the Department of Labor decided to, put out that notice that, they're putting it on pause because they need to see what happens. But they are defending it, and they do think that, they have a case to defend it. And so it's possible that that case, no matter whether it is the stay continues or they reverse it, which personally seems unlikely, it could go to the Supreme Court and they could take it up there. But none of this stuff happens incredibly quickly. And so I think we're just going to have to kind of stay tuned.
Yeah, listen, we cannot wait to have you back again. There's obviously going to be much more to come. Claire, thank you so much for, sharing your expertise and your time with us and our Rev Divers. This has been super helpful. Until we meet again, Rev Divers, keep diving into those Rev cycles. We'll see you again next time.